My name is Clark Murdoch. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, long-time Washington hand. I held many jobs in Washington except for the State Department. And I run the project on nuclear issues at the CSIS. I have a couple of announcements to make before an introduction. The first is that after all of the sessions scheduled today, everyone is invited to the lunch reception at the Asan Institute. Buses will be waiting outside the first floor main lobby entrance and will leave at 11:30. Please meet our staff members at the lobby entrance after the plenary session and closing remarks end. I'm pleased to be here on this last day of the conference. Again, I want to thank the Asan Institute. This might have been a conference that went on an inch too far, given the attendance at today's session. But I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Laura Salman, who is an associate in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment in Beijing. And her research focuses on Chinese nuclear weapons and nonproliferation policies and Sino-Indian strategic relations. And a former boss of mine, Walt Slocum, senior counsel at Kaplan Drysdale's Washington, D.C. office, formerly the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Clinton administration, although I worked with him also in the Carter administration. And in 2004, President Bush appointed him to the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the U.S. regarding weapons of mass destruction. We're here to talk about perspectives on the United States Nuclear Posture Review. I wanted to start with just a few comments upon the U.S. perspective on this, and then turn it to Laura for the Chinese and to Walt for the Russian perspective. I'm a little compulsive. There's a handout at the tables on what the U.S. nuclear agenda is. I think people have to recognize that the nuclear posture is not just a single report. It's actually a series of decisions that were made over the process of a year. It was the same group of people involved in making the decisions. I've already realized, based upon our discussions in the past 2 days, that this is an incomplete handout. It should have started actually with a going-in position for the United States at the opening of the New START talks with the Russians in March. I think it was the time it was done. It should have included the Prague speech and President Obama's personal agenda for this. This is something I wanted to emphasize because Tom Donilon, the NSC advisor to the President, gave a speech recently in which he emphasized that it was the, quote, President's deep commitment and personal involvement as the driving force behind our nuclear strategy. And that this was according to the speech, something was continued. He did a stock taking, so to speak, of the Prague agenda and evaluated the progress that had been made on all four elements and indicated that this was going to continue. This summarizes the Nuclear Posture Review. It summarizes the New START Treaty, and I apologize. I think it was a question of space. I apologize. The Ballistic Missile Defense Review Report, also the European Phased Adaptive Approach, which was a decision on ballistic missile defense, which was a decision made in September of 2009, and some of the budgetary actions. It should have also included the Nuclear Security Summit, because this is one of the four major themes of the Prague agenda, and of course is a central preoccupation of our hosts here in this country. I believe it was included, but it was dropped as we tried to go to 2 pages. But I apologize for that. Another thing that, and I think this is listening to Elaine Bunn talk about the conventional side, and my characterization of the Nuclear Posture Review, I emphasize how nuclear weapons and nuclear dangers are being identified and the shift there. But another thing that's emphasized very strongly is that this Nuclear Posture Review also includes an increased reliance upon conventional capabilities. And I think, as we've seen in terms of previous panels, in terms of the preoccupation of both the Chinese and the Russians with what the United States is doing on the ballistic missile defense front and on the conventional prompt global strike capabilities, that this represents a major preoccupation of our hosts. We tend to look, or I certainly tended to look, at the NPR as being about nuclear posture. But I think when the United States says, as it did in the NPR, quote, "But fundamental changes in the international security environment in recent years, including the growth of unrivaled U.S. conventional military capabilities, enable us to fulfill these objectives, deterrence, assurance, and global stability, at significantly lower nuclear force levels and with a reduced reliance upon nuclear weapons." The equation in the NPR is sort of, security is sort of a zero-sum game. If you increase your reliance upon conventional capabilities, you can somehow reduce your reliance upon nuclear capabilities. When actually it's a variable sum game, and you just might be getting more security with the role of nuclear weapons continuing undiminished in terms of their contribution to security. But there's no question that in terms of perceptions of the NPR, that the increased reliance upon growing conventional military capabilities is a message of the NPR report that has not gone unnoticed. And with that, I'll turn it to Laura to talk on the Chinese side.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation from Dr. Murdoch and also from the Asan Institute to come and speak here today. And since we're talking about perceptions, I've been tasked with talking about the Chinese perceptions on this. And basically, this comes from my own research. It comes from a report that I released through the Carnegie Endowment, which is entitled China and the Nuclear Posture Review. And so if you're more interested in my analysis, I would recommend looking at that as well. Today's talk is called Defining Strategic Stability, China Debates the NPR. This is based on interviews that I conducted immediately after the release of the NPR and within the 6 or 7 months following that last year. They were at the Chinese Arms Control and Disarmament Association, also at the Academy of Military Sciences, and NDU within China, a number of different institutes, about, I would say, at least 10 or so, including universities as well, and also conferences I attended since that time. I also looked through articles, all primary sources, all in Chinese, so directed at the internal audience predominantly within China, and covered 298 articles from 1981 through present day, and more recently through 2011, because I updated my research with 124 new articles. So it's a pretty wide range of views and perspectives there. Now, in terms of the Nuclear Posture Review, as some of you probably are already aware, the perception of China within this new document was much stronger than in the past. At least we have a full copy of the document, so we know exactly how many times they referred to China. And it increased precipitously to 36 mentions of China. Not only that, in 19 of these cases they were paired with Russia. And how were they paired with Russia? It was in the context predominantly of this idea of strategic stability. So I was really looking to see how that term has been defined over time within China and now especially within the NPR. Now, in Chinese, strategic stability is 战略稳定 or 战略稳定性. So I went using that term through these databases to see how many times it was referred to. And what I really noticed, one of the things that struck me right away, is strategic stability as a concept in China has a lot to do with balance. And they frequently use the term 战略平衡, which is strategic balance, essentially, in tandem with strategic stability, meaning that in an asymmetric environment that we find ourselves in after the Cold War, and this is obviously a Cold War term previously, there is a tremendous imbalance between China and the United States and Russia as it sees itself. And I don't know that necessarily they entirely buy into this concept. I'll be getting into this in a few minutes. But the suggestion from a number of analysts on the U.S. side is that perhaps this means the United States is willing to engage in, accept its mutual vulnerability in its relationship with China. And so my main question was, are Chinese experts convinced? Now, in terms of strategic stability over time, in my report I have these charts, so you just have to take my word for it. But basically, in the attention that was paid to strategic stability, it clusters in two specific areas. The first of these was from 2000 to 2002, 2003. And it was during that time period, you see it predominantly used in the context of the U.S.-Russian relationship. missile defense. Those are the contexts that it's mentioned the most frequently. In 2007 to present day, obviously the focus has actually spread out to a number of issues. It's not just about the U.S. and Russia anymore. It's about China, it's about the NPR, it's about a number of issues, a range of things that I'll be covering today. And then I think what really typifies most of the discussions I saw within China, that a lot of the analysts, a lot of the people who are looking at this, strategists, scientists, everyone, will talk about the positives. There are definitely a number of positives that they see in this document. But I found in each case that there was a positive, it was usually paired with a negative, a caveat. So just to give you a brief overview of what these positives are and their caveats, the first of these is there's a general perception within China that the NPR is a policy document. It's not posture. You know, you talk about it as a nuclear posture review. It's more of a nuclear policy review, in their opinion. They appreciate the fact that a good deal of compromise went into this document. They're very well aware of that. They know the internal politics in Washington quite well. But at the same time, they will often point out that there are a number of other strategic documents that basically contradict what we see in this terms of policy. And they frequently point to OPLAN 8010. They frequently point to the fact that China is still being targeted by the United States. This targeting has not gone away in other documentation and also in U.S. strategy. They are appreciative of the fact that nonproliferation and nuclear terrorism have now moved to the forefront, that we're moving away from this Cold War structure of two superpowers essentially pitted against one another. But at the same time, too, they're very much aware that that means that there is a greater tendency to focus now on the small to medium-sized nuclear weapon states, which would include China, and also the aspirants. When they talk about nonproliferation in Chinese, actually it's interesting, most analysts prefer to use the term arms control than nonproliferation. Nonproliferation is heavily laden with double standards of focusing on the have-nots. And they see obviously the Russian and the U.S. role as integral to this. And there's also a concern over absolute security, which I spoke about at length yesterday, so I won't get into that today. In terms of disarmament and the reduction in numbers, there's a strongly positive response to that. They're in support, obviously, long-term towards disarmament. At the same time, too, they point out when you look at New START, when you look at these initiatives by the United States and Russia, that they are accounting games. They actually use the word games, 游戏 in Chinese. So that actually it's just by changing around the numerics and how you calculate things, how you count numbers, that you can make it seem like you're doing more than you are, and they're more worried about qualitative leaps on the part of the United States in particular. They appreciate the fact that there's no nuclear modernization under the new NPR, but they also talk about, quite frequently, I had a number of analysts use the word backdoor in Chinese with me, this homen for conducting subcritical tests, simulations, using advanced computer simulations, and they even still refer to the reliable replacement warhead. They see this as being more of a rhetorical document as well. You have a reduced role for nuclear weapons. They recognize that, and this is pointing to this conventional issue we were just talking about. But again, once again, in terms of actions, they don't know that those necessarily back up the rhetoric. Budgets, for example, how much the United States is spending on its nuclear program. Extended deterrence, which we've been talking about a good deal, if that's actually reinforcing the role of nuclear weapons, and also the strategic nuclear triad. They see a lot of corollaries between what is happening now under the Obama administration and still they look at the historical precedents under the Bush administration as well. They appreciate the strengthened negative security assurances under the new document. However, they do note that DPRK and Iran are still very much present, even though they're not named. You know, within the document, it still makes an allusion to those countries that are not in compliance with their NPT obligations. And automatically, it's almost a Chinese document in this way. Everyone knows who they're talking about, but they haven't actually named them. They're also concerned about this idea of extreme circumstances under which the United States would use nuclear weapons. Is this a Taiwan contingency? Is this a South China Sea contingency? Are they going to continue exerting nuclear coercion, as it's called in China? And while they see an end to a nuclear arms race, there is a concern about a start of a conventional arms race, and that's been pointed out today. And when I ranked the rhetoric, when I ranked the number of times these different terms and issues were mentioned, actually conventional weapons really went up to the top of the list, which is interesting because in the past I think you would have found ballistic missile defense as being right there. Now it's conventional prompt global strike that's being talked about the most, and missile defense actually falls to 5th place, which is an interesting transition. Now, in terms of just contrasting themselves with Russia, because I mentioned this pairing with Russia, and we talked about in a few minutes the Russian perspective. There's an agreement that, yes, China and Russia are non-allies of the United States. You can make that allusion, but they don't want to be seen as a little Russia. There's a sense of being forced into this adversarial relationship that the Soviet Union and the United States had previously, and they realize that this is not a condition that they want to be pushed into. They don't want to engage in an arms race. And they've learned the lessons of history on that point, very, very much so. There's also a concern about the fact that they see the document itself as being very mohu or vague and abstract, that it lacks concrete measures to achieve with China. Once again, where I pointed out before that it reminds me of a Chinese document in certain ways, I'd say on this point as well, that it's talking about grand principles, strategic stability, a big term without a lot of specifics. And they contrast that with the relationship with Russia, where you have discussion of demerving. You have the issue of intercept being relocated in order to have a more cooperative relationship, a cooperative framework when it comes to ballistic missile defense with Russia. In terms of the U.S.-Russian goal, they saw that as being more military balance. To this day, it's considered to be a balance issue. Once again, this Jianwei Pinghang. The China-U.S. goal, though, is they see the United States wants to maintain the imbalance between the two, and that's an important point. They see the United States as trying to restore its moral high ground, its leadership position, but at the same time, too, there's a lot of concerns about where it's headed in terms of ballistic missile defense, space advances, advanced conventional weaponry. I think one of the biggest things that I saw was this idea that trust follows transparency in this former Soviet U.S. and now Russian U.S. equation. They're looking more that transparency has to follow trust. You see this in all the documents. They don't feel that there's enough strategic trust in order to be transparent. And I know in the U.S. conception it's probably the reverse of that. They also see a lot of this as having to do with slogans. There's a concern overall that China is being targeted through this whole idea of a race to parity. And so where does this leave us? I think the ultimate contradiction that I see the most frequently referred to and stands out for me as well is that this idea of strategic stability is countermanded by the whole pursuit of conventional weaponry to basically replace that deterrent. You know, Jeffrey Lewis would probably disagree with me on that. But also ballistic missile defense. In concentrating on those programs, those are seen as breaking apart strategic stability. So in a document that you're talking about strengthening strategic stability, all the ways that you're doing it break it apart. In terms of definitions, from the Chinese side, what I hear the most frequently is they're seeking a declaration from the United States that it accepts mutual vulnerability with China. They don't see it being explicitly stated, even if it is implicit in the document. It's still not there. While they see the United States as seeking strategic advantage over China. And in terms of this vagueness that I mentioned before, in filling the void, what I find happening a lot when things are not defined well, there's a tendency to put in other terms that instead of what actually is maybe the United States' intention with that term. So you see a lot of reference to hegemony, to power politics, and to this strategic advantage that I talked about before, and also absolute security. And one of the things, as I mentioned before, in saying I felt this was a very Chinese document in some ways, the NPR, is that I see a lot more specifics, actually, interestingly enough, coming out from the Chinese side now. In most of these articles that I'm talking about, they list all the areas they want to see more cooperation with the United States, very specifically. Sometimes, very pie-in-the-sky type of things, but they're still interested in that. And from the U.S. side, I see a lot more focus now on these terms. However, that being said, I think the U.S. has something to offer. It may not be delivering it entirely clearly, and I think that's where we could strengthen the U.S. role on this. In terms of public relations with China, I think it's doing a poor job in the sense that you have these documents like New START. You have the nuclear budget that's coming out in the United States, and they're really, from the Chinese perspective, tomes. And what I find in a lot of cases is Chinese experts are relying on media reports, speculation. They're not actually reading the original documents. They're too long to get through. I would recommend for the United States, if they're going to release any of these documents in the future, is having a short guide, for example, the guide that we just saw that was handed out to you, that really breaks it down into bite-sized pieces that people can digest and actually process. Otherwise, they're going to rely on this speculation, and that's a bad sign. Also on the mixed message, there's a perception in China, and this is long historical perception, in terms of the United States, first of all, wanting China to become a part of a process, join in, and then rebuffing China's efforts to join in that process. The perfect example is the missile technology control regime. For a long time, the United States wanted China to be a member, and then when China said, okay, we're going to be a member, then all of a sudden the U.S. was less enthusiastic about that. Cyber and space, another thing that comes up quite frequently, you'll see, is that it's only when the United States is really worried about another country's capabilities, then it's willing to engage that country on whatever issue it is. Living in Beijing, I see this all the time, delegations from the United States now wanting to engage on issues in terms of space, in terms of whether it be peaceful use of outer space, what have you, that in the past they were reluctant to talk to the Chinese about. And we know after the ASAT test some of that came up. And I see, so ultimately, what do I see? I see in terms of goalposts, the U.S. seems in this document unsure what the goalposts should be for moving ahead, and I think that leaves a lot of room for China to change the goalposts. And as I mentioned yesterday, they're conflicted on disarmament. They're conflicted on how they perceive this argument, or this document. Now, in the last minute, my last slide is basically how to move forward, setting the table for strategic stability talks. I think that, I mentioned this yesterday, I think the multilateral forum makes the most sense to me. There's a positive reaction to the whole meeting that took place in London in 2009. That continues to be seen very positively. At a bilateral standpoint, I think actually the strategic economic dialogue has been very, very intelligent in mixing two fields where it's not just about targeting China in a strategic sense. It's dealing with the total relationship, and they seem much more comfortable in that regard, too. So I think multilateral forums, but then also forums that allow them to not feel like they're being targeted in a military sense. Clarification of strategic stability vis-a-vis China. I think it's still a Cold War term. We still tend to think of it in the U.S.-Soviet context. It needs to be redefined. Advanced conventional weapons, CPGS, these are things that you're going to have to talk about at the table. Also, this idea of phased adaptive approach with ballistic missile defense. This is something that comes up again and again and again. It's not as important for some reason now. I think advanced conventional weapons have replaced it. But I think a cooperative framework for how we want to engage China. If we can talk about it with Russia, I think we can talk about it at some point with China. Pre-launch notifications have been mentioned by Elaine Bunn yesterday. Weaponization of outer space, because ballistic missile defense ultimately for the Chinese, and this is pointed out to me by all kinds of senior colonels, is really just about space weaponization. I mean, let's be honest about it. In terms of surveillance, they're concerned about space radars, naval vessels. These are things that not necessarily that the U.S. has to give as gifts to China, but at least needs to discuss with them in terms of its regional deployments. And also more cooperation, scientist to scientist. I know we keep coming back to the Cox report, but it does matter in China. It matters to the Chinese. And also a reconciliation of NPR rhetoric with some of these strategic documents that I mentioned before and actions that they see countermanding them. And finally, I think it's important to move ahead with FMCT. The Chinese are paying close attention to, first of all, the debate on the New START, and they're paying close attention, I think, to where the United States is headed on CTBT, on FMCT, on everything. That's going to define whether or not the United States is committed to what it's talking about within the NPR. So finally, in conclusion, strategic stability, I still see myself as a value-laden Cold War term. It's taken in the U.S.-Soviet adversarial relationship. This is worrisome to China. They don't want to be cast in that mold. If it's not defined, though, in the China context, then they're going to fall back on this Cold War concept. And it's contradicted, as I mentioned before, by ballistic missile defense and CPGS. And I would argue it's actually probably the wrong term to be using. I would actually argue against using strategic stability, but that term has been set. I have a feeling that, like responsible stakeholder, like everything we use to define China, that's going to be the term of the day. So I would still encourage moving away from a focus on terms in search of definitions. That's how I look at this term. And concentrate on specific achievable measures. Among these, the most positive thing I've seen come out of the NPR that has really captured the Chinese imagination is on this nuclear terrorism issue, nuclear security and safety post-Fukushima. These are areas they really seem to be engaging on at all levels. I see a strongly positive reaction to that. A cooperative framework on ballistic missile defense. I know that's probably not in the offing right now, but really to define this term through actions, not through rhetoric. And finally, I just quote President Obama at his Prague speech in April 2009, where he did say words must mean something. And I think that this is the perfect example of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, first of all, let me join in thanking the Asan Institute for assembling a remarkably diverse and I noticed that both Clark and I have the term senior in front of our names. And I think it's particularly valuable that there are some new faces and new perspectives to this debate which has been going on, or this analysis which has been going on for, I guess, 60 years. In some sense, the issue that we're talking about is how American declaratory policy affects, in my case, Russia, in Laura's case, Chinese views of American nuclear policies. But obviously, and very much as Laura has said, the Russians take actions into account, and they take statements other than simply those which are in the 40 or so pages of the nuclear posture review into account. And there's obviously, particularly in a room where there are a fair number of Russians, a certain paradox to having an American speak on what the Russians think about the American policies. So inevitably, although I believe what I say is based on what Russians have written and said, although I certainly cannot claim to have followed the Russian literature in the detail that Laura has followed the Chinese, inevitably this is an American perspective on Russian policy, and to use the Jesuitical phrase, I speak subject to correction by actual Russians on what the Russians think, or amplification. I also think it's important to start out with what the Russian view seems to be of nuclear weapons in general, because that sets the context for what they think about American policies on nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are a key symbol and a key part of the reality of Russia's continuing claim to status as a superpower and to be the equal of the United States on the international stage. It's only one. There are others. Russia is a huge country. It has vast resources. It has a big population. But nuclear weapons are central to the Russian status in international affairs. Moreover, Russia has a doctrinal reliance on nuclear weapons for deterrence, explicitly including for conventional wars. Now, in the most recent Russian military doctrine, that's qualified by the sensible observation that the use of nuclear weapons would be limited to cases where the existence of the state is threatened. But clearly, the Russians are even less doctrinally ready than the United States to say that nuclear weapons are important only for nuclear deterrence. As I'm sure you all know, there was a big debate within the administration and in the United States over the use of the term, whether we should say that nuclear weapons are solely for nuclear deterrence, and they came up with the formula of the fundamental purpose. My own preference, and this is relevant to the Russian view, my own preference would have been to say that nuclear deterrence is the only mission, the only military mission for which the United States needs to rely on nuclear weapons, which is not to deny the possibility that they could be used in other contexts. The Russians, I think, are clearly not prepared to go that far. They see nuclear weapons not just as a critical supplement to conventional capability, but as a central part of their military posture. All this without, I think, having in the slightest way any doubts that nuclear war would be a terrible catastrophe, that nuclear weapons are not a simple solution to military problems. And from this follows what I think is the central Russian concern, which I have heard echoed at this meeting as well as in things that have been written, and that is a deep suspicion that the United States, whatever it's prepared to do about China, is not prepared to accept in the long term the status of mutual vulnerability with Russia, and that somewhere lurking in all of this rhetoric, all of these supposed restraints, supposed resets, and so on, is an aim to offset Russian nuclear weapon quality and capability to deter. There are specific elements of this, but I think that's the context. Russia also regards nuclear weapons as one of the principal, if not the principal, focus of the bilateral interaction between the United States and Russia, very much as it was during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and in some sense the revival of the arms control process as the centerpiece of reset, not that it's the only part, but that it is the centerpiece. Russia shares the nominal priority, and I have to say I think it's somewhat nominal in the American context, that certainly in Russia, the priority to nonproliferation, the prevention of nuclear terrorism, and long-term disarmament is stated in the Nuclear Posture Review, but heavily qualified. I think it's even more heavily qualified in the case of the Russians. I have to confess to a serious methodological error. In contrast to academics who actually study subjects, lawyers are notorious, I'm a lawyer, lawyers are notorious for imagining that in a short period of time they can understand anything and make a presentation. I misread Clark's email to me telling me what I was supposed to talk about, and I saw NP, and it's the abbreviation I always use for nonproliferation. So I did quite a bit of research on the Russian view on nonproliferation. I hope to get invited to a conference someday, which I can use this text. But it is an interesting perspective. But as with the United States, to be fair, Russia balances its genuine concern, and I think it is a genuine concern, with nonproliferation, with other national interests, including, I think, the national interest of not either carrying America's water or being seen to carry America's water to an excessive extent. Russia is also, and this is an interesting difference from the United States, now in the midst of a substantial investment of modernization. As a technical point, one of the big problems with the Russian arsenal is that it's very big and very capable. It's also aging. I mean, we're all aging and aging at exactly the same rate. But the Russian arsenal does need replacement. Much of it is past its shelf life and can't be extended indefinitely. They have active programs to develop new ICBMs and new SLBMs, and presumably protecting those programs will be concerns in the future. So what are more specific Russian views of the NPR? As I said, nominal agreement on the sort of big picture, hearts, violins, and background music, nonproliferation, and so on. And they certainly welcome broadly improved nuclear relations with the United States, not only for their own sake, but as a resumption of the U.S.-Russia dialogue on nuclear weapons as a centerpiece of our relationship, and indeed as a centerpiece of international relations generally. And yet there is much that creates disquiet and concern on the Russian side, almost all of which are ultimately related to the issue of whether the United States has some long-term desire to undercut the Russian deterrent, undermine it. The first point is, of course, missile defense. I started out in this business during the effort to get Senate approval of the President Nixon's safeguard program. This has been an issue between the United States and Russia from the very beginning of the arms control process, and it is still with us. The cancellation of the so-called third site was welcome, but the Russians certainly do not accept and do not like the explicit provision in the NPR, in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, and in the rhetoric and actions of the administration, which make clear that the United States is committed to build a viable, workable missile defense against limited attacks, both for the homeland, U.S. homeland, and for our allies, to the extent that it's technically and financially possible. And they rightly see the phased adaptive approach not as a fundamental change in American policy, but a reorientation, and as providing both for missile defense at facilities in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, to some degree, what the Russians have managed to do by persuading, and I think it is the case that the administration changed the plan because it thought it had a better plan, not because of the Russian objection, but the Russians objected. What they have succeeded in doing, of course, is getting a situation where the United States is proliferating radars and missile defense systems all over the world, and is likely to go on doing that. And to the degree that the Russians have views on these subjects, I think as the old regime would have said, objectively speaking, the Russians don't like phased adaptive. The more the Russians look at the phased adaptive approach, the less they like it, or at least the less they think that it's really changed American views. The Russians are open in principle to cooperation, and I think there are things that we can begin doing on this that will have a positive impact on the relationship and may, in principle, do important things on both sides, both to the degree that it is possible, reassure the Russians that whatever America's very long-term purposes, they will see any change in our missile defense approach long coming and be able to respond to it. And I hope on the American side to introduce a certain element of rationality to the proposition that you can talk about missile defense of the Russians without, selling them California. Although actually, given the problems of California, I'm not sure that maybe we sell them back Alaska with its ex-governor or something like that. The second area of specifics is a conventional prompt global strike. This concern, in my view, is grotesquely exaggerated by virtually everybody. The plan is for very limited, and in my view, unfortunately, very long delayed, because we're going to do it in a technologically extremely elegant but extremely challenging way. But it is certainly it's seen by the Russians, like missile defense, as something which is not a current threat. The Russians are not foolish about this. They're not seen as a current threat, but as something that has the potential to be expanded in ways that would give them concern about the survivability of their nuclear forces. And I think more broadly, as a specific aspect of a broad Russian concern, which goes back to the Soviet time, that the United States has technological advantages which put them at an inherent disadvantage, and deep suspicion that the United States has the option, even if we're not exercising it now, has the option to create real problems for Russia's capability. They also note the emphasis on non-strategic nuclear weapons, which the Russians regard, and quite explicitly in their discussion of these issues, as necessary to compensate for Russian real or imagined conventional disadvantages. And I think they regard the United States as fairly typically hypocritical to be greatly concerned about this issue, because it used to be our policy to rely on tactical theater nuclear weapons to offset real or perceived conventional disadvantages. I'm sometimes fond of saying that unfortunately it turns out that the Soviet intelligence stole the NATO doctrinal documents from about 1960 and unfortunately believes them and has adopted them as some kind of reverse engineering of a faulty doctrine. Anyway, it is seen as something where the United States puts on the agenda an issue on which Russia has an inherent advantage, and the United States, linen is hardly clean because of third country basing and so on. The Russians also, particularly in their more technical writings, emphasize the problem of non-deployed American nuclear warheads. And not because the Russians don't have a lot of non-deployed strategic warheads. Unlike the United States, they don't have a whole lot of empty spaces to put them on. The Russians are, objectively observe that whereas the United States has achieved and will achieve the new start levels basically by downloading existing systems, the Russians, to a higher degree than the United States, have achieved it by reducing the number of launchers, so there are not nearly as many places to upload. And they regard this as one of the inequalities in the relationship. The long-term disarmament goal and the countervailing maintenance of deterrence are certainly broadly shared with the United States, but I get a tone out of some of the Russian writings that the American attachment to global zero and to reducing the role of nuclear weapons is aimed not just at the broad goals of an improved and less dangerous world, but as specifically undermining the one area in which the Russians are fully equal to the United States. And don't misunderstand, the Americans believe that too in the nuclear field. I remember being at a meeting during whenever the financial crisis in Russia was, and somebody from Treasury said, we didn't bail out the Brazilians, we didn't bail out the Thai, why are we supposed to bail out the Russians? Somebody from the State Department said, about 10,000, what's the difference? And somebody from the State Department said, about 10,000 nuclear weapons. I think Russia has a continuing view that nuclear weapons are at the core of its international status, and that to some degree the United States is trying, the United States certainly opposes any formal delegitimization of nuclear weapons, but the United States is, just as it is conspiring in the long run to undermine the Russian deterrent, is conspiring to undermine the legitimacy of the one aspect of military power in which Russia is clearly not only co-equal with the United States, but stands head and shoulders above anybody else in the world. I think also the Russians realize quite correctly that the Americans' continued emphasis on extended deterrence is a problem for them. They see it as a part of an overall effort to maintain U.S. hegemony, and inevitably as aimed more at, if not them, at least them and some of their friends, than it is at anybody else. They also realize quite correctly that Obama, like any president, is not the only factor, the only force setting American policy. And they've noted the difficulty and some of the rhetoric of the ratification campaign. I suspect also they've noticed some of the problems about getting ratification in the Russian political system, and they realize that there are real constraints arising out of a complex and fraught domestic politics on both sides. But certainly on the American side, they may see the sort of sweet reasonableness of the administration on all these issues as a mask for the John Kyles and so on who stand behind and reveal the real American objectives. Our agendas for future arms control are, I think, quite different. The Russians want to address missile defense, conventional precision weapons, third country forces, and so on, all definitely, if not anathema, at least subjects that the United States has no particular interest in seeing addressed, and not just for political reasons. There are obvious domestic political reasons, but there are other reasons why these are not on the U.S. agenda and are high on the Russian. I also, and it's a less controversial point, the Russians would like lower levels in most areas in strategic forces, don't want to because of the problems with the modernization of their force, and they don't see anything in it for them in limiting non-strategic nuclear weapons. One can hypothesize, especially if you abstract yourself from domestic politics, one can hypothesize a complicated grand bargain in which all of these issues are somehow addressed. But the two sides will start future arms control negotiations with a very different list of things they want to see addressed. In short, I think it's fair to say that Russia views the NPR as an essentially conservative document, maintaining American perspectives on the role of nuclear weapons, with some very modest steps toward reaching Russian concerns, but reflecting continued U.S. commitment not just to nuclear deterrence, but to aspects of nuclear policy that Russia sees or claims to see as threatening both Russia's status as an equal power and, more specifically, its nuclear deterrent. It's a very good thing that U.S.-Russia relations are better than they were in the recent past, and there are some aspects of U.S. policy that are intended to, and that I think have rightly been seen by Moscow as addressing some Russian concerns, but there are still very big gaps and probably on nuclear weapons, and probably more serious, very big problems, concerns the Russians have about U.S. long-term goals and purposes. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. First of all, I want to thank all of those who drifted in after the panel began.
This is an impressive turnout.
That's right.
8 o'clock in the morning on the last day.
That's right. As the chair, speaking on behalf of the panelists, we're all deeply grateful. And as a reward, I won't ask any questions in the prerogative of the chair, but instead turn it open for comments. Sir. More than just a comment, I suspect.
Okay. My name is Alexey Finenko. I'm from Institute of International Security Studies of Russian Academy of Sciences, and I have one comment and one question for Mr. Slocum. My comment is that Russian nuclear strategy historically formed not by original sources, but for the United States conceptions. How? Because historically Soviet Union he didn't have its real original nuclear strategy. Nuclear weapons in the Stalin's, Khrushchev's period was only new type of weapons, and that's all. And only in 1960s, when in Soviet Union was published a lot of translation books of Herman Kahn and other American specialists about nuclear deterrence policy, about flexible response. Then in 1970s, Soviet Union and then Russia in 1990s formed its original nuclear strategy. And my question for Walt is there a real difference between Russian and United States nuclear strategy? Or it is the same and the difference is only technical, operated, but not conceptual?
Well, I think there's a great deal of similarity. And it is similarity broadly in a positive way. That is, I think both Russia and the United States understand, first and most important, and even the Soviet leaders, I think, understood this increasingly, as Americans. And I mean, Americans started out with the idea that nuclear weapons were just sort of super artillery. More to the point, Americans started out and acted on the proposition that having spent vast amounts of effort on a strategic bombing campaign to burn German and Japanese cities, we finally had a weapon which would do it efficiently and effectively. So the idea, which was you can argue, my view is that the morality of nuclear weapons in the Second World War is the morality of the strategy of trying to burn German and Japanese cities. I think it is clear that people had no sense of the kind of qualitative difference which followed from the quantitative, the need to shift from 1,000-plane raids to burn a city to a single plane with a single bomb. It's not a uniquely Russian failing to have, or a Soviet failing, to have imagined that nuclear weapons were simply another military weapon. That I think on both sides there was a gradually increasing but very profound sense that nuclear war was not a sensible military option. It might be necessary. It might be that the day would come when you would have no choice, but that it was not simply a continuation of military operations by different technical operational means. And I think that's a very important similarity, and I think that's at the base of both countries' nuclear doctrine. That said, I think Russia sees nuclear weapons in two important respects differently from the United States. The United States enjoys, according to an analysis I read recently, the United States spends more on defense than the next 17 countries put together. The Defense Department's budget is larger than the GDP of most of the members of the United Nations. Now, the Russian budget is larger than the GDP of a lot of members in the United Nations. A lot of very small members of the United Nations with very small GDPs. But the United States, I think, is much more in a position of viewing nuclear weapons as I like to put it, needed, essential, only to deter nuclear attacks on the United States and its allies, and is very much at most, there would be remote contingencies in which we would have to use nuclear weapons other than in the context of a nuclear or a potential nuclear exchange. I don't think that. The Russians say it's not their view. I'm prepared to take them at their word. That is an important difference. I'm not sure that there's that much of an operational difference, as I say. I think if the Russians now believe that you can use nuclear weapons to make up for conventional inferiority, they will quickly find out all the problems that we found when we tried that doctrine. But there is a difference in view. And the second is that I think the Russians see... Sure.
But it is all the United States conception.
Of course it is. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, but flexible... Look, as I say, I think you've stolen the plans and unfortunately believe them. I don't know. No, I don't think there's any... with due respect, there are a lot of other countries who think that the United States can use nuclear weapons to solve their defense problems that could be solved by conventional means. It's not that the Russians are unique in this approach, but I do think it's a part of a difference. I think also Russia sees its nuclear weapons as much more central to its, at least in the military field, to what makes it important and powerful. It quite apart from how nice it would be if it turned out that somehow uranium ceased to fission. The United States would be better off probably today if there were if nuclear weapons could not work. I don't think that that's the Russian view. I think those are the two biggest differences.
I would like to actually follow up on what Walt said, because I think it pertains to the point that Laura has made as well. The Russians are a lot more clear about how to define strategic stability today than the United States is today, but perhaps not as clear as the United States was 20 years ago. Because first strike stability, the way they refer to it, is a sort of the force structure component of strategic stability. And the Russians today will say, well, what do you need for strategic stability between the United States and Russia? It's very clear. Survivable second strike capabilities. A large percentage of your capabilities are able to launch on warning, which means that you've taken away the temptation to preempt. And you have to have approximate parity with the United States. So if the Russians look at it that way, and that's the way they define strategic stability, and the United States is talking to the Russians about strategic stability, very hard to apply that definition to the Chinese without raising all sorts of hackles, because none of those exist on the Chinese side. So this is a case where there's a major, I think, asymmetry, where the United States is applying a same term that's fairly well understood in the U.S.-Russian dialogue, which doesn't fit the U.S.-Chinese dialogue. Next question. Josh.
Josh Pollack, SAIC. I have a question for Laura Salmon. You had mentioned that there is a Chinese view of the U.S. nuclear posture review as being in tension with the contents of O-Plan 8010. And for those who don't know, O-Plan 8010 is a Strategic Command deterrence plan and global strike plan. But it is not a public document. So what do Chinese scholars and commentators believe to be the contents of O-Plan 8010, if you're able to tell, and why do they think it's in tension with the nuclear posture review? And furthermore, why do they think it shouldn't be when one document was written after the other?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. On this point, and this kind of points back to something I raised during the talk, which is this idea that a lot of what I see coming out of China is based on speculation, on media, because they don't either due to lack of access or because these documents are just crushing in most cases and not well explained by the U.S. side. What I do see frequently come up in regards to that particular document is once again speculation. But the speculation has become the reality for a lot of people, as it frequently does. That China is considered still to be a target, along with Russia, that has not gone away, because that's one of the things that's been pointed out that was different with this NPR, is that China's not named as one of these targets, right? So their argument is essentially that, yes, they are still a target within these other documents. In fact, you'll hear within China a number of people I spoke with directly and interviewed on this subject made the comment to me, well, we think that there's actually another nuclear posture review. This is not the actual nuclear posture review. This is the policy review that the U.S. is allowing the rest of the world to see. There's another document in the background, and so when they point to that document, that's not having the actual the text. That feeds into this concept. Exactly. Right. It's a missing document. Well, when I talked about filling that void, when you have a void, whether it's a void in how you're defining a term or it's a void in terms of information that they have access to, they're going to naturally fill that. And unfortunately, right now, it's being filled with a lot of speculation.
Again, to follow up a little bit on that, and this is a point that Amy Wolf would have made if she were here, is that we are now engaged in what is known as a White House-directed targeting strategy review that are intended to see how did the NPR change our strategy in ways that would affect what the op plan might look like. The Republicans, of course, are saying, well, this is trying to go, how do you do a strategy review that results in the need for fewer nuclear weapons so you can go lower? While those who are conducting are saying, well, we've done an NPR that followed, since we've done an updated planning directive, it's time for us to take a look at how the NPR affected that. So, again, this is one of those cases where the United States is talking to two different audiences. One time it's talking to its domestic audience, at the same time it's talking to its Chinese. We don't know yet how the NPR is affecting our strategy for targeting. Also mentioned on this question of targeting, anybody can be targeted. It takes about 30 seconds, if that. Now, how you plan, phased adaptive planning is the terminology. We plan lots and lots of contingencies all the time. Targeting is something that's done only in a specific operational setting. Next question. In the very back, there's two people who've raised their hands. Why don't we group those two questions, and then I'll come to the middle table.
Good morning. Alex Thoma, the Connect US Fund, and this is a question for Laura. I was just reviewing some notes. We've convened very, very high-level meetings with advocates and think tanks, various other sectors in the U.S. to talk with U.S. policymakers, the Pentagon and State Department at the White House on the nuclear posture review. And one of the things that came up in these meetings was that, well, and this is a question, how do we bridge this? The perception that the Chinese value secrecy and that they're being very cagey with their U.S. counterparts. And that came up again and again. So there seems to be a misperception. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that the Chinese are being very transparent. At least they think they're being very transparent. And the U.S. is saying, well, they're being very secretive and vice versa. So how do we bridge that gap? It seems like it would be pretty easy just to bring together the Chinese colleagues with their U.S. counterparts and just talk about it, but it seems like that's not happening or not possible. So what, from your knowledge of how the Chinese are working around this, how could we bridge that?
And there was another question right next. No taker.
Morning, Nadia Larson, DOD. But my question will be from the Russian perspective to Mr. Murdoch and Mr. Slocum. My question is, if U.S. says that missile defense is so harmless, why would NATO reject Russian, president's plans in using common missile defense and refuse to give any, security guarantees to the Russian, which then Minister of Defense, stated that it can absolutely result in the arms race. And my quick comment to Mr. Slocum, and maybe you can comment on that. I was just doing, also making notes, and the tone of how you presented. It was a little, and that's this, and I kind of see the same tone on the higher level officials, that the tone is a little, I don't know. Laughing, I don't know how to say it, but kind of laughing, the concerns that Russians have, which are legitimate concerns, they are presented in a little kind of childish, I don't know, way. Do you think if the tone of the debate changes, maybe not even the context, but the tone, that it will result in a better cooperation, because Russian officials are usually insulted by the way that U.S. presents, or their concerns.
I certainly didn't mean to be insulting.
Oh, no. Yours was fine, but I just see the same kind of approach that, U.S. officials take when they address the concerns that Russians have.
First of all, I think I have accurately reflected what the Russians say they're worried about. I think there are many instances in which those concerns are not justified. We may be able, by exchange and by dialogue, to convince them that they're not justified, including by doing things to address their concern. On the specifics, so I certainly didn't. Well, I guess one of the points about it being an American perspective on Russian concerns. The Russians, I think, really feel these points, and I don't, and I think they have some basis for some of them. I think, for the most part, they are exaggerated. The United States, whatever we think about China, and it is a complicated question, we certainly have accepted long ago, and when our relations were much more fraught than they are today, that Russia has an invulnerable deterrent, that if we wanted to do something, if we wanted to negate, we couldn't, because the Russians have a complete capability to frustrate any American effort to do that. On the more specific question of why did the United States reject the Russian idea of cooperation, I mean, I can't speak for the Obama administration. I certainly can't speak for the Bush administration. I think the Bush administration did make some pretty far-reaching offers to the Russians on this issue. The United States, however, is not the issue, and I think there is a real potential for cooperation between the United States and Russia on missile defense. The United States, and not just because of the Republicans in the Senate, the United States will not accept an arrangement in which Russia has a veto, a sort of dual-key arrangement over the use of an American missile defense system. I don't think, in all candor, I don't think the Russians would accept that with respect to the defensive systems which they have. That doesn't exclude the possibility of negotiation, and I honestly think it's an exaggeration to say that even the Bush administration simply rejected Russian proposals. They made quite far-reaching counter-proposals, which for a variety of reasons weren't taken up, no doubt in part because the Russians thought they were inadequate. I do think that missile defense cooperation is an area which has real value both at a political level of taking some of the poison out of the missile defense debate and at a technical level of providing measures which will, if the Russians are prepared to be reassured, will reassure them that there's no, what an American administration will do in 50 years, nobody has any idea. That all you can do in this world is to make clear to the other side that before anything happens, they will have lots and lots of notice and lots of time to respond to it. And I don't think the United States is ever going to do this, and therefore that will solve the problem. But that's the best you can come up with.
Laura, on secrecy versus transparency.
Sure. Very good question, and I'm asked it quite often. I think in terms of Oh, there's the microphone. In terms of, I think this really gets to the heart of the question. In terms of transparency, it's become kind of a four-letter word within China. I see people's eyes glaze over the minute transparency is mentioned, and yet it continually gets mentioned by everyone I see coming to China. I think asymmetry, first of all, just points to the heart of the question. And you'll hear this, and it's a knee-jerk reaction. They'll say, well, in an asymmetrical situation, you have countries like the United States, like Russia, that can afford to be transparent, right? They have these massive arsenals, and they're in a much more comfortable position. And for a long time, I was thinking, well, that's just a knee-jerk reaction. It's not necessarily an answer to the question. But I think that it is an answer in the sense that when you look how they've structured their nuclear arsenal, when we talk about what their nuclear strategy is, in terms of size, force structure, no first use, even their doctrines. I know no one wants to buy into no first use, but I think there are some telltale signs that they are observing this policy that can't just be dismissed. And so I think that there is a degree to which asymmetry does guide their decision to be less transparent, and just the nature of their force structure. You can't be transparent about a minimum nuclear deterrent because it would be too easy to decapitate it. But more and more I hear a number of Chinese analysts saying that it also has to do with domestic politics. And I think we ignore this with China a lot. We're always talking about how China's reacting to the rest of the world and how they're viewing China. Domestically speaking, there just hasn't been the same level of requirement, demand within China for that level of transparency. They see it in the United States all the time, people demanding the U.S. government to be more transparent. You still don't see it in China, although I would argue that there are a number of arms control analysts who are trying to get the government to be a little more transparent. So that may change in the future. But in terms of numbers, I don't think you'll see, they aren't going to be transparent about that. In terms of intent and strategy, they feel that they are being as transparent as they can be and have been very explicit all the way through. I think that engaging them and kind of teasing out more transparency is probably the goal of a lot of these bilateral talks. I think in a multilateral forum it's less threatening, as I mentioned before, and you're probably likely to get them to talk about things they might be uncomfortable about talking about when they're being targeted. I would just point out that I'm able to do this research in China. I'm American. I can go and I can download a lot of articles. Very rarely do I get that little message that it's a secretive, it's classified in the Tsinghua system or elsewhere. I've been able to talk with people at the Academy of Military Sciences. I've gone to the Academy of Military Sciences and had people willing to engage with me, active duty, non-active duty, retired, all levels, major generals downward, are willing to speak with me. And I think that really does show that there is a higher level of transparency than we give China credit for. And I'll use the analogy, I do research in India as well. In just my own reaction in doing research in both countries is in China, I have much more access to active duty military than I do within India. I've gone to the hill towns and not been able to talk with anyone. So I think we do them a discredit in assuming that they're as non-transparent as they've always been. I think there actually is a curve, and it's on the upswing in terms of transparency.
I agree that transparency. I'm not sure I agree about strategic stability not being useful vis-a-vis China. I certainly think there are limits to the idea that transparency per se is really what's at issue. I mean, my guess is, General Welch not being here, my guess is I've had as much exposure to the American nuclear doctrine and nuclear forces and nuclear plans as anybody in the room. A great deal of what is said about American nuclear, the details of how American nuclear forces work, is said by people who have no way of knowing whether what they're saying is true or not. All countries that have nuclear weapons maintain a lot of secrecy, I think legitimately, about many of the details. And I think it would be better to invent some word other than transparency. And I think it's incumbent on the United States to identify what it is we want other people to be more forthcoming and more formally disclosing about. With respect, the fact that you can read lots of articles that have been declassified, in effect, doesn't mean that there are not important areas where the Chinese could disclose more information at no real cost to their security, but considerable gain and confidence of understanding. And I think, for example, the United States only in the last year or so has revealed a number which is the total American stockpile of nuclear weapons. The United States has not revealed a great deal. There's a great many things that the United States hasn't revealed, although probably among all the nuclear powers, even the British and French, we say more about our nuclear forces, partly because of our appropriations process. On the other hand, I have to say I find it, maybe the word is irritating, that the Chinese purport to be so surprised at the claim and so offended when they claim that the United States, quote, targets China. Technically speaking, the United States and Russia, and I think the Chinese, don't target anybody in the sense that the coordinates are not in the missiles. A better question is, the United States does not think that it is a part of its mission to deter the UK or France. But obviously, it's quite clear in American official statements that we made no bones about the fact that we regard it as necessary to have a force which, in the unlikely event that the United States and Russia had such a profound deterioration in their political relations, that the issue of having to deter them arose, that we would regard one of the missions of nuclear weapons as to deter Russia. And the Russians make no bones about that proposition with respect to the United States, and it's equally true with China. And who do we suppose the Chinese ICBMs are aimed at? They can't be aimed exclusively at India.
Mr. Arafat, your hand has been up several times. This question and this question. We have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I originally have two, but I have one. I give you one comment about the strategic stability. During the NPR review process, the Japanese side has serious concern on how does the U.S. government write about the strategic stability with China? When more precisely, whether U.S. government refers to mutual vulnerability or not. And finally, the meaning of the reference to strategic stability is more ambiguous, rather than in terms of U.S.-China relations. I don't think it means mutual vulnerability. In that sense, that's very good for us. And as Maddox-san said, before, that mutual vulnerability is not a matter of choice, but a matter of fact. However, clearly mentioned in the official document, whether clearly mentioned in official documents or not is big difference. So in that sense, I hope United States continuously maintain these kinds of ambiguity in whether U.S. accepts mutual vulnerability or not. And as you discussed, in my sense, stable strategic relations is more favorable word than strategic stability. But anyway, the definition of stability in these bilateral relations should be discussed not only in U.S.-China bilateral strategic talks, but also it should be consulted with Japan, South Korea, to form the definition of the stability with China in the new age. So that's my comment.
And another comment right there, and then.
Thank you very much. Masa Ota with Kyoto News on the follow-up my Japanese colleague comment and regarding the Chinese view on the specific case of the U.S. deterrence provided for Japan. I mean, for Chinese, maybe U.S. deterrence provided for Japan would be some benefit for China because that would be a good factor for U.S. to dissuade Japan to go to its own nuke, especially responding to a North Korean nuclear situation. So how do they see this, outside of the effect of the nuclear deterrence for Japanese country? Thank you very much.
Laura?
It's a very good question, and I've often, when I first started attending these talks within China, I always thought it was a very contradictory stance, and that was 10 years ago. Now, when you hear it referred to the most, there's a recognition that yes, that's what is keeping, say, Japan and ROK from choosing the nuclear option. But I think they have a point in the sense that if we really want to devalue nuclear weapons, if we want to get to disarmament, if you want to talk about these things, you can't have such a heavy reliance within your strategic planning on nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a counterintuitive argument. I understand that, and I think that's part of what they're making. A lot of people also read it as China also trying to lower the U.S. influence in the region. But I agree. I think it's a contradictory stance, and for better or worse, I think from a larger disarmament argument, they have a point. But I think in terms of what the reality is on the ground, I think that obviously it's problematic as well. So I know that's not a great response. And I just wanted to make a point, too, on this whole, just to touch back on what was being said before about this whole track 1, track 2, track 1.5 level, and this issue of transparency. I just wanted to also make the point that I think that, there's been a great deal of talk in the United States or irritation about China not wanting to engage at the track 1 level or shutting down talks whenever there's a disturbance to the relationship. And one of the things that I found striking to me is once again, this comes from my own research on India and China's relationship, is that there's a tendency only to talk at the track 1 level, and at the lower levels they don't really engage that much at the 1.5 and track 2 level. And I found that there's a tremendous number of misunderstandings because at the track 1 level people just come and they read their statement and that's it. There's no larger engagement. And I just didn't want to discount the fact that when we think they're not being transparent, when we think that they're blockading our understanding of them by not necessarily engaging at the track 1 level, it's actually conversely contributed to our better understanding, I think, of them, because you have more back and forth. You have people in the room who write the reports that go up to the top. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think both need to be involved with each other. Thank you.
Walt, do you have a final comment?
No, I think I'm all in favor of discussing these issues, and I think there is a real value to having some of the discussions at least be among people who don't have to clear all their talking points, who are not always speaking under instructions and so on. I mean, I spent a good deal of my life saying what the United States government thought, which may or may not. I'm always fond of the footnote you sometimes see at the beginning of articles by government officials. The views expressed in this document do not unfortunately necessarily reflect the views of the United States government. On the other hand, I think to some degree there is an inherent difference, even more pronounced in the case of China than with Russia. Let's be honest, the United States is a vastly more open society with respect to positions that can be expressed on these issues and the degree to which they reflect. There's a huge range of views in China on these issues, I'm sure. It's somewhat different. I have to say that as somebody who's lived through a lot of exchanges with the Soviets, the sheer quality of Russian writing on these issues, which wasn't all that bad during the Cold War, is just quite remarkable. I mean, there are serious discussions of serious issues with numbers and figures, obviously based on real knowledge of the details. That is just, to my knowledge, not true of a lot of the Chinese writings on these issues. And in a sense, part of that is about the transparency issue. Thank you all for coming. We're getting all kinds of signs that...
I was going to take the prerogative of the chair to make the last comment, but since I've been told definitively, please end, I will end by expressing appreciation for the panel and for people in the panel.
This is the end of session 9. We'll now have a quick coffee break. The final plenary session will start in 15 minutes in the Grand Ballroom. After all the sessions scheduled for today, every